Thank you very much. I'm back again to introduce our last keynote lecture. Unfortunately, Professor Arthur Frank is unable to join us today because he caught a winter virus and has lost his voice. But his lecture is going to be delivered by Professor Daniel Spencer from Columbia University. So I'm going to introduce both speakers. I will introduce first Arthur Frank. We're very, very grateful to both for accepting our invitation to join us here today. Professor Arthur Frank is Professor Emeritus at the University of Calgary, Canada. He has written, many of you will be familiar with his work. He's already been mentioned several times in the course of this conference. His works include At the Will of the Body, about his own experience of illness, the very influential Wounded Storyteller, and most recently, King Lear, Shakespeare's Dark Consolation. So in The Wounded Storyteller, he talks about the wounded storyteller. And in the meantime, he's found it important to also look at the vulnerable reader as a counterpart to the wounded storyteller. His most recent articles appear in Perspectives in Biology and Medicine and Narrative Works. Among his honors are election to the Royal Society of Canada, the Society's Medal for Bioethics, and the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Canadian Bioethics Society. And we're immensely grateful for Arthur Frank for having accepted our invitation to be here. And are also very, very honored to have Professor Daniel Spencer from the Columbia Program in Narrative Medicine. Arthur Frank has been co-teaching some seminars with Professor Spencer within the Columbia graduate program in narrative medicine. Daniel Spencer is an artist and is also an author of various works in narrative medicine. She is the co-author of 2 chapters from Principles and Practice in Narrative Medicine, and one of the co-organizers of that volume with Professor Rita Sharon as well. I invite you, Daniel, to talk to us today and not only deliver Arthur's lecture, but also add your own testimony about your own experience of teaching together and of being part of the Columbia Narrative Medicine program. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much for having us, I should say. I know that Art was very disappointed not to be here. He's fine, but he lost his voice. So I'm actually very grateful for the opportunity to inhabit his words and be with you here today. So I'm going to read the text that he prepared here, and then I'm not sure when I finish we can see if we have time for discussion. But yes, so Art and I have co-taught, and we recently collaborated on a chapter called Illness Narratives from Analysis to Answerability, which was published in the Handbook on the Sociology of Health and Medicine, provided the opportunity for us to reflect on the genre of illness narratives, which, again, I'm sure many of you know, he really is such an important figure, having written critically and personally about the genre at a time when it was not the subject of much scholarly interest. And so I myself read his books as a student, had a great influence on me. So it's an honor to be collaborating with him and to be reading his words to you here today. So the title of Art's talk is Narrative Medicine, Its Stories and Vulnerable Reading. So I will begin. Narrative Medicine as Disposition and Dialogue. I want to begin by admitting that I do not take the phrase narrative medicine very seriously. For me, it's an easily spoken label of convenience. Over the last 30 years, a number of different projects have been undertaken that share what the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein called a, quote, family resemblance, by which he meant a resemblance that most people can recognize, but is hard to specify. This lecture will offer a few specifications of what the family resemblance is among projects that call themselves narrative medicine, but I scatter these along the way to emphasize that they are my ideas, not prescriptions for some field of study and practice. I hope my remarks today don't seem to exclude anyone's work. This resemblance called narrative medicine is nicely expressed in a quotation that has stuck with me for a number of years. The bioethicists David Schenk and Larry Churchill, in their book Healers, report interviews with a number of physicians who were recommended by their colleagues as having the best relationships with patients. Here's my favorite from what these clinicians said about their work, quote, I took a class with a famous psychiatrist who taught techniques of patient conversation, including recommendations to, quote, lean forward and, quote, sit on the edge of your chair. I asked, wouldn't it be better just to be interested in your patient? That, for me, expresses what matters most about narrative medicine, what the family resemblance might be. Please notice that there's nothing said about narratology or interpretation or about what's called professionalism. The physician probably never heard of narrative medicine, but he seems to be doing it. What's evoked is a relationship that begins with one person being genuinely interested in another person. Narrative medicine begins with people feeling other people's genuine interest in their lives and then responding to that interest. Being interested does not fit what North American medical education likes to call a competence. It's not a skill. The best descriptive word I know for being interested is that it's a disposition. Our dispositions are the building blocks of who we humans are in relation to the worlds we inhabit. What we pay attention to or shy away from reflect our dispositions. What we are able to take seriously depends on dispositions. The great social theorist of disposition was Pierre Bourdieu. I think it's maybe not too terrible a simplification to say that for Bourdieu, sociology was the study of what people could take seriously and the considerable ways that affects lives and life chances. I understand narrative medicine as a disposition to be interested in the people whom one encounters in clinical settings. It's a disposition to take the fullness of people's lives seriously. For clinicians, that disposition precedes such matters as treatment effectiveness. For an ill person, narrative medicine might be described as a disposition to figure out how being ill is part of and maybe changes their own life. But it's also being interested in these strange people called clinicians. I contrast the attitude of being interested from the attitude of simply dividing clinicians into those who help and those who hinder. Many people, both clinicians and ill people, move through clinical settings without that disposition of being interested. There is plenty else in those settings that appeals to or demands people's attention. Please notice that when I say people, I mean both healthcare workers and those whom medicine calls patients. That again is why, on my account, narrative medicine is not a clinical skill or competence that a professional acquires and then practices upon other people who are the beneficiaries of that competence. Being interested in people is a necessary part of relationships that I call dialogical. In dialogue, speech is always responsive. Speakers are responsible for how well they respond to each other. Relationships based on dialogue mean each speaking in response to what the other has said, or maybe what they think the other has not yet been able to say. The accusation, "you're not listening," whether it's explicitly voiced or held as a thought, marks a breakdown in dialogue. The fine balance that narrative medicine always seeks is between all that is necessarily asymmetrical in clinical relationships and the necessarily mutual participation in dialogue. Clinical relationships begin in asymmetry. One person is sick or vulnerable to becoming ill, and the other is well or hopes they are. Further asymmetries accumulate including on whose schedule the two people meet, who determines the relevance of what is said, who gets to wear clothes, who has access to what information, and who can make certain decisions that affect the other. Narrative medicine seeks to balance these asymmetries against what dialogue requires, which is each's recognition of needing the other's participation. The word dialogue is very important to me, so let me give you one of the most profound examples I know. It's a pivotal scene in Tolstoy's War and Peace. The French are occupying Moscow, and one of the book's protagonists, Pierre, has been arrested on suspicion of arson, which the French believe Russians are carrying out as a form of resistance. Pierre is brought before a French official, Davout, who is judging the fate of a succession of suspected arsonists. Davout questions Pierre and seems to believe he is lying, which Pierre partly is. Then we reach the dialogical moment, which need not have happened, but against the odds it does. Here's the quote. Davout looked up and gazed intently at him. For some seconds they looked at one another, and that look saved Pierre. Apart from conditions of war and law, that look established human relations between the two men. At that moment, an immense number of things passed dimly through both their minds, and they realized that they were both children of humanity and were brothers. At the first glance, when Davout had only raised his head from the paper where human affairs and lives were indicated by numbers, Pierre was merely a circumstance, and Davout could have shot him without burdening his conscience with an evil deed. But now he saw in him a human being. He reflected for a moment. I read that passage as a small but insightful allegory of clinical relationships. Clinicians are like Davout. They can lose themselves in papers and screens on which human affairs and lives are indicated by numbers. Ill people can become equally obsessed with numbers by which they learn to represent their health, even how they feel. The dialogical moment is whenever two people look up and see each other apart from the conditions of medicine with its professional boundaries and institutional imperatives. Tolstoy describes Pierre and Davout seeing each other as children of humanity. I recognize in myself a resistance to that metaphor, and I try to stay with that resistance, asking, what exactly do I resist? Why the metaphor might threaten me? The metaphor affects me because my reading has been stopped at the moment of the look and the mutual recognition that the look brings about. So much depends upon that look and how it shifts the emphasis of which dispositions are at play. The dispositions that go with playing one's appointed role in conditions of war and law, or the dispositions that attend seeing oneself and one another as both being children of humanity. Davout then disappears from the story. There's nothing more Tolstoy can say about his encounter with Pierre, so I will not try to say more. But I hold on to that description of their mutual look as my exemplar of dialogue. Section 2, Narrative Remoralization. In the 1980s, when I found few models for the work I was struggling to imagine doing, the writings of the psychiatrist Arthur Kleinman were crucial influences on me. As I emerged from several years of critical illness, Kleinman seemed to come closest to telling the truth about the healthcare industry as I had experienced it, and he seemed to best appreciate how much was at stake in telling that truth. Kleinman was willing to say that healthcare demoralizes both its practitioners and its patients. My own account of this demoralization begins with healthcare settings requiring people within them to collude in evasions of truth-telling. Institutional medicine demands the collusion of both its staff and its patients in multiple pretenses of what counts as adequate care, and sustained participation in that collusion drives people crazy. What I found most liberating about first-person illness narratives when I began to read them after my cancer treatment ended was that the authors willing to tell stories that would make healthcare workers and family members uncomfortable. But for the ill person, there cannot be healing until those stories are told. And telling one's own stories begins, in most aspects of life, with hearing others' stories, which is one of the many reasons why the stories we tell are never really our own. For the last 30 years, a considerable proportion of my writing has collected and sought to amplify stories of moving through demoralization to something else. What that is varies between stories. As a brief stand-in for those stories, I can quote the New York literary critic Anatole Boyard, writing about dying of prostate cancer. Quote, "Yet the real narrative of dying now is that you die in a machine. Kafka has a wonderful story called The Penal Colony, in which a criminal is put in a machine that inscribes on his body with a needle the nature of his crime. We die through those machines, and that's not the right way." Demoralization results from having to expect a machine to respond to your suffering. Clinicians' demoralization begins with the demand that they respond to suffering only in their circumscribed roles as part of a machine and deny their own suffering. What I myself most fear about some future illness is less being sick and even dying than it is having to go through illness dealing with machine-like responses. Thus, for me, narrative medicine collects diverse projects of remoralization that all somehow involve telling stories, but not just any stories, because the times have changed. When I wrote my memoir of illness, At the Will of the Body, and then when I wrote The Wounded Storyteller, about many people's stories of illness, the paramount need of the moment was giving voice to ill people themselves. Putting it bluntly but truthfully, physicians got all the airtime. Their voices alone were privileged to represent illness. I was lucky to be sorting out my experiences at a time when the idea that one group was entitled to speak for another was so widely criticized that I didn't take it seriously. The idea that ill people have distinctive stories to tell, stories quite different from clinical professional narrations of what happened to them, was and often still remains radical. Here's another quotation from Boyard. "While he invariably feels superior to me because he is the doctor and I am his patient, I'd like him to know that I feel superior to him too, that he is my patient also, and I have my diagnosis of him." The title of the essay in which Boyard wrote that, originally a grand rounds presentation, is "The Patient Examines the Doctor." I believe many healthcare professionals still find it disquieting to imagine that their patients are diagnosing them. They want to imagine the gaze to be one-directional, but that denies dialogue. One significant change in the decades since illness memoirs have included mine and Boyard's is the proliferation of personal storytelling, especially on the internet. Those stories certainly help people to feel less alone, but too many storytelling projects seem to me to perpetuate the insularity of groups that already suffer from being out of dialogue with each other. Narrative medicine programs often include writing groups in which healthcare professionals express their frustrations and anxieties, but so long as participants remain within their group silo, they and their patients will not become engaged in dialogue, so they won't become able to help each other. I believe they need each other's help. The narrative medicine I imagine, or maybe idealize, would remoralize people by having them share their stories. The objective of this sharing is that each, in their stories, could present the other as what literary critics would call a more rounded character. Tolstoy's characters exemplify this quality of being rounded. The same character does things that are short-sighted, arrogant, self-sacrificing, and noble. Shakespeare's characters are like that, blind one moment and insightful the next. If the work of the 1990s, which was my time, was to enable ill people to speak in their own voices, today's work may be to bring those stories into dialogue with each other. Let me suggest only 3 qualities of what I would call dialogical stories. My full list is longer, but you should add to the list yourselves. First, I would like to hear illness stories in which there is no single protagonist, but rather multiple characters, each with their own fears, struggles, and suffering. Narrations describing the best of bioethics consultations exemplify such stories. In such stories, no particular outcome is foretold at the beginning, and at the end, the quality of indecision remains. Thus, the second quality of my desired stories is that they are not teleological. Instead, the ending is always in question. The third quality I would like in stories facilitated and nurtured by narrative medicine is that they are self-reflective about what shapes the kind of story each person initially feels they have to tell. Medical school is systemic training in narrations that are called case presentation. Student physicians learn the rhetorical form of such narrations, and there's a low tolerance for narrative deviation or innovation. Becoming a patient involves less formal but hardly less rigid leaning of narrative expectations, the most fundamental of which is that the clinician's understanding is correct, even in matters that the patient finds painful. Dialogical storytelling reflects on who or what wants stories to be told a certain way, and also on what narrative resources shape their telling. I want stories that have these three qualities because I want narrative medicine to be more than therapeutic for individuals. If narrative medicine does not aspire to transform medicine as an ordering of relationships, then it may be momentarily useful to particular people, but the same problems will persist. The fundamental demoralization will remain unaffected. From what I have said, I think you will understand why I believe it is within the remit of narrative medicine to ask questions about healthcare that can be called structural. Healthcare is a system, and that system is driven by money. How money drives healthcare varies between countries and often within countries, but wherever you go, healthcare consists of jobs, including being a patient, that have demands, and those demands involve who pays and who gets paid and how much is paid for what. Narrative medicine can never place itself outside those issues. Medical finance is not narrative medicine's specialty, but it is the background against which narrative medicine happens. Section 3, vulnerable reading. One of my hopes for narrative medicine is that it remain a loose affiliation of people doing projects that have something to learn from each other. My nightmare is that someday a professional organization might offer certification in narrative medicine, institute some set of best practices, and then try to exclude those who are not so certified. That takes me back to where I began, with the idea of narrative medicine as a disposition to be interested in other people. In a clinical session, just being interested, as expressed by the physician I quoted, may accomplish a good deal in terms of remoralizing both the clinician and the patient. But narrative medicine then asks for a next step, which is turning what's said and heard into a story, because that gives durability to what would otherwise be the feeling of a moment. To do that turning into story, would-be storytellers have to know stories. Stories are told in response to other stories. One story calls for another, but they also grow out of other stories. In this last section of my remarks, I want to talk about the work I've been doing for a few years on what I call vulnerable reading. One response to my initial quotation of the physician who is interested in his patients is to ask where that disposition came from. A tautological answer is hard to avoid. That's the kind of person he is, meaning that is what his disposition disposes him to do. To aspiring clinicians, that sounds disturbingly fatalistic. Dispositions are not destiny. Rather, they are instilled. Dispositions gain force as the result of habits, behaviors reenacted multiple times until they become what we call second nature. Vulnerable reading is a way of shaping our dispositions through habitual practices. Thus, it may fall into the general category of what philosophers, including Michel Foucault and Pierre Hadot, call spiritual exercises, ways of becoming a desired form of self. Vulnerable reading is a way of paying attention to what one reads so that reading becomes a resource in times of future need. It means reading from a position of self-conscious vulnerability, either immediate or potential. As one example, a recent interview in the New York Review quotes the philosopher Martha Nussbaum talking about the death of her adult daughter. She describes how her experience of the death was affected by having played the role of Clytemnestra in a faculty production of The Trojan Women. Quote, "So my inner world had been prepared, almost rehearsed for the biggest shock of my life when my daughter died at the age of 47, after a long illness of a fungal infection after surgery. As she was dying, I found myself in tears, hearing in my head Hecuba's speech over the body of her grandson when she says that she had always expected to die first. And all of a sudden, she has to mourn this young child. I think that mental preparation was a kind of roadmap that made me feel less alone and less clueless in my grief. Nussbaum's words could be called a self-description, but I prefer the word I used in The Wounded Storyteller, which is testimony. She offers testimony to the power of literary tragedy to affect personal tragedy. Her testimony is especially articulate, but not unique. Other people speak of how different literary works affected their particular tragedies, and a common message can be heard. Reconsider my quotation of Anatole Boyard. Knowing Kafka's The Penal Colony offered him something between a metaphor and a narrative frame that made him feel less alone as he confronted the impersonality of the hospitals in which he was treated. Knowing Kafka, Boyard could tell the story he needed. To tell stories that help us encounter suffering, whether our own or that of others, we need what Nussbaum describes as the preparation of her inner world. Illness is worst for those who have not rehearsed, as she calls her own experience. What she calls the mental preparation that offers a kind of roadmap must be acquired, and vulnerable reading is the process of that acquisition. Vulnerable reading, as Nussbaum describes it, is not yet dialogical, but it can be. An initial move toward dialogue would be if Nussbaum were to reflect on what I suggested earlier. How did her participation in performing the Trojan Women also prepares for the outer world? It prepares her to enter the multiple others who must have been part of her daughter's dying and to appreciate their struggles and their assigned parts. Nussbaum was not only rehearsing a character for herself to play, she was also learning to be part of an ensemble in which each part somehow depended on all the others. Vulnerable reading most clearly becomes dialogical if one project of narrative medicine is to sponsor reading groups that include a mix of different health professions, people with different illnesses, and family members. As each hears the others speak to how some reading affects them or might in the future affect them, the isolation that compounds vulnerability would be reduced. The difficulty of putting such groups together would say a good deal about what I called conditions of demoralization. Vulnerable reading will probably remain a small project within the wide scope of narrative medicine. At this late moment in my professional life, it seems a good project for me, and that is the permission I would like to offer each of you. Please understand, narrative medicine is a field of open-ended possibilities on which we each need to find our own particular ways to contribute, and those will change. As a compass point of true north to guide us on the shifting terrain, I recommend keeping in mind the encounter between Pierre and Dawood, in which adversaries recognize their shared humanity. How does any narrative medicine project prepare people to realize the possibilities of such a moment? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you, Arthur, also, for a lecture that brings us down to basics by reminding us of how important it is to just take an interest in the other person. So that very basic foundational attitude, to realizing that that requires remoralizing everyone, so every person interacting in these experience of illness and provision of healthcare and so on, and that entails becoming aware not only of the other's vulnerability, but of one's own vulnerability. And as you mentioned when delivering Art's lecture, also Martha Nussbaum's testimony of her experiences of as a mother of a daughter who died prematurely at the age of 47, and then how she reflects on how all this reading and reflection had somehow provided a roadmap, a direction, and had perhaps made internal room for facing what she had to go through. I don't know if there is any question in the room here, but but I was going to ask you, Danielle, if you would be so kind. From your experience of teaching in a graduate program in narrative medicine at Columbia, how is this issue of vulnerability experienced by the students? How difficult is it to engage with? Or easy? I don't know.
Yes. Well, I think we don't necessarily use that term. I mean, this is a phrase that Art has been thinking about and starting to write about. But I think it's an integral part of our program because, you know, it's an academic program. A lot of our students are, some are working clinicians and some are planning to go to mostly medical school, and then some are journalists and artists, poets, social workers. You know, there's quite a variety. And one course that we require everybody to take in their first semester is called Close Reading, Giving and Receiving Accounts of Self. It's referring to the book by Judith Butler, which is also on the syllabus. And we read a lot of texts, mostly literary texts and some film, that are not explicitly about illness or healthcare. And this can be a bit surprising and discomforting to some students who would expect that everything would be topically focused upon that. But what happens there, and I mean, as well as other courses within the program, is that reading these works calls upon each of the readers, each of the students in the class, and the instructors as well, all of us. And there's a space balanced within what's primarily an academic setting, but there's a space for that reflection and to recognize, honor the ways in which one is called as a reader. And I think, and people often, there's some pre-selection for the field, you know, people who've had experiences with illness and healthcare. And it often happens that people reflect upon past experiences vis-a-vis illness or caregiving through the lens of the text that we're reading, even if they're not, quote unquote, about illness or healthcare. And I think that in so doing, it's also what Art's calling vulnerable reading, in the sense that it gives some kind of language, some kind of narrative context in which future experiences might be understood in relation to them. Of course, that's a process that would happen over time, but certainly people then having some kind of experience, you know, of grief or loss, for example, could have, you know, thinking back to having read certain texts or a group of texts in this community of people, to have that as a helpful framework for understanding. I've certainly experienced that myself, both prospectively and retrospectively, in the sense that sometimes I read something and it makes, you know, helps me to make sense of something I experienced in the past.
Yeah. So it helps to process past experience and potentially to prepare for future experience. But it's the habit of reflection then that is important also to develop, I suppose.
Yes. And it simply demonstrates that that one is not detached from what one reads or watches, you know, that one is always, the process of interpretation and reaction is always present and active.
Yeah. And the fact that it's done in groups also makes a difference, rather than sitting at home alone and doing it by oneself. Yeah.
It's crucially important. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Any question? So a big round of applause to Danielle and Arthur for your collective work. Thank you so much for joining us from New York, and what is this morning to you, this afternoon to us. Thank you. We hope to see you in Portugal one day.
I love that. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.